So, Chapter 7 of the textbook focuses primarily on assessment and grading. And this, of course, is an important chapter to cover because all teachers are going to be required to submit grades at one point. So it's important to make sure that those grades are actually a reflection of the student's learning, that they actually mean something. So what exactly is assessment? If you remember from the first chapter, we defined several different terms, and assessment is that process that includes all the above: measurement, the evaluation, the identification, and prescription. It's something that needs to be done consistently and continuously throughout the teaching of a skill, not just at the end of a unit. So for example, if you're teaching the beginning of a volleyball unit, there should be developmentally appropriate instruction and skill development provided, consistent feedback, maybe some benchmark tests to determine the learning progress, reflection, evaluation of those benchmark tests, and then modifications in instruction to ensure that you're actually teaching and meeting the needs of all the students. And this is something that needs to be done at every step of the process in teaching new skills. Of course, assessment leads to grading. And when grading, you as the teacher are determining the student's achievement level, which is what they've learned. And this level is usually identified by a letter grade, or maybe a certain amount of points, percentages, or some other description of performance that's related to an overall objective or goal. And when considering assessing the student performance and determining the grades, we also need to address the negative associations that go along with traditional grading methods. And what I mean by this is that letter grades or points don't always reflect true learning or the level of a student's learning that's demonstrated. Partially because of this, teachers are encouraged to use alternative assessments. And alternative assessments are just different methods of assessing student performance. Rather than only assigning a letter grade or point system to some performance criteria, alternative assessments can take what we call an authentic assessment approach. And keep in mind that letter grades can still be determined by using authentic assessments. It just makes the grade more meaningful. So using authentic assessments, a teacher can get information or obtain data, remember that data stuff, that provides a more accurate reflection of students' learning. So authentic assessments usually allow a teacher to monitor the student's performance and determine whether or not they're experiencing difficulties so that the teacher knows what to do. Then number two, from there, prescribe a correction for learning problems. So when students are having some trouble, the teachers know how to correct those problems and that trouble that the student's having to improve learning. Number three, it helps them to keep track of students' progress towards the class goal or objectives, because we need to know how far away are students from meeting those end goals or objectives. And then four, to fairly assign grades, emphasis on being fair. Typically, when some teachers develop an assessment or assesses student performance, the process doesn't always follow the correct guidelines to provide an unbiased or fair result. But using authentic assessments, this helps to ensure that assessments are fair, they're free of teacher bias, and they provide an accurate reflection of student learning. So some of the characteristics of authentic assessment include formal record keeping, and this is something that's going to be time consuming. It takes a long time to do over a process of time. And so a lot of teachers avoid formal record keeping, but it's when you document every single thing that a student is doing that identifies any learning problems that they have, some troubles that they're having, difficulties they're experiencing. And this needs to be done over a period of time. And so it's a process of keeping records on all the students. It can also be natural surroundings, and this is conducted while students are performing a game type situation or game-like conditions. It may use some type of chart, some records while doing that game, because once you teach a student a particular performance, you can put them in a natural surrounding of a particular game that you've been teaching, and then be able to identify if that student is able to function properly in the game, if they are able to understand their role, all the skills that are required in participating in that game. And just through observing them, you can identify some of the problems that they may be having. And then this in turn should help you go back and correct some of those problems. Also, formative assessments. And remember that formative assessments are those assessments conducted during the teaching of a skill. And these are frequent. They provide feedback. They identify areas that require additional instruction. There's something that's done routinely and not limited to certain days. And they can also help to motivate students. And so formative assessments should be something that you're consistently doing throughout the teaching of a skill. And then there's summative assessments. And summative assessments are those final end of the unit culminating assessments to determine a student's achievement towards an end goal. And most teachers rely solely on summative assessments as a final grade, but final grades should be a culmination of both formative and summative assessments. Also, in my opinion, final grades should also be a reflection of the quality of teaching. If you've taught the skills correctly and aligned instruction with the goal, there should be a higher rate of success in class. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to get an A, but the rate of improvement or the rate of success that students are having should be higher if you've actually taught and you're assessing based on what you've taught. Authentic assessments can also be used when assessing a student's technique and their form in performing a particular skill. And this is called the technique and end result, or technique, form, and end result. So to address the subjectivity, and that's when a teacher uses their own personal judgment or bias or opinion as to whether or not a student has accomplished a skill objective, the technique end result assessment should be done using a rubric. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here on rubrics because that's going to be one of your assignments that we're going to be coming up on soon, and we'll spend more time discussing the development of rubrics later. But just know that there are different types of rubrics to use based on your assessment expectations. So take a look in the textbook for the descriptions of each type of rubric and familiarize yourself with those. It's going to come in handy later. Now, authentic assessment should also include a self-assessment and peer assessment. And self-assessments will take some time. They can be effective if they're done and structured properly. The students need to understand exactly what's expected when they're doing a self-assessment. So they're trying to correct their own individual performance. And setting this up can also help with motivating students because they're not comparing their performance with someone else. In addition to peer assessment, which can also be effective, and sometimes it's better than doing a self-assessment because peers, if structured correctly, again, are a lot more critical in identifying problems and errors than sometimes the teacher is. So it's important to help the students understand what exactly they're looking for when you're doing self-assessment and peer assessment. And this is another quick, easy way for the teacher to receive some feedback. Also, portfolio assessments can be used. And with portfolio assessments, the students are responsible for collecting portfolio contents, and that may include tests, written assignments, any type of rubric outcomes, individual assessments, records of practice, anything that you can think of that a student can use for assessment purposes should go into this portfolio. But once again, the student should be responsible for collecting this. And then once a unit is done or a particular period of time is covered, the teacher can then go back, review some of those portfolio assessments, review that content, and then help to develop a grade based on that information. But the purpose of a portfolio is to document and demonstrate what the students have learned and how they have progressed. Remember, it's important in physical education to take into consideration the progression of skills because you're dealing with motor learning difficulties, you're dealing with developmental problems. And so students aren't always going to demonstrate the end goal result that the teacher wants, but allowing them to demonstrate progress towards that end result can also be helpful. Now, all assessments should be guided and should be aligned to the National Standards for Physical Education. Now, they were originally developed by the National Association for Sport and Physical Education, or NASPE, but the national standards have undergone several different revisions. And NASPE was eventually changed to Shape America, and Shape America stands for the Society of Health and Physical Educators of America, in 2014. They published an updated revision of the national standards, and this is what all physical education instruction should be aligned to. So the national standards highlight the goal of physical education, which is to really develop physically literate individuals who have the knowledge, the skills, and the confidence to enjoy a lifetime of healthful physical activities. Part of meeting that goal is to create effective assessments in addition to providing effective instruction. Now, let me ask you this question. How do you know that a letter grade is an accurate representation of a student's overall performance? Now, think about this for a second. Consider the grades that you've received in any class, not just in physical education. Were you informed on the grading process? Did you know exactly what all the expectations were in determining your grade? Do you think your grade was fair? Do you think all the students were graded consistently? Do you think all the students received a fair grade? Grading has always been a topic of concern, not only in physical education, but in all subjects, primarily because there's been no consistent, no clear, objective, reliable process of determining most grades. If you think about grades in physical education, what are they primarily made of? Attendance, dressing, behavior, participation. Now, these don't represent learning in any way. They represent what we call compliance. So as long as a student is complying with the rules and the expectations of the classroom or of the teacher, whether they've learned something or not, You can still get a good grade as long as you're there every day, as long as you dress, as long as you behave, and that behavior is up to some discussion as to what the teacher thinks. The same thing with participation. What is participation? That is up to, the definition of the teacher, how they define participation. So it doesn't demonstrate that you've actually learned anything. And this is one of the things that contributes to the perception that PE is insignificant, that it's not important, or it's not to be taken seriously. Grades should be an accurate representation of achievement towards course objectives, but going through the process of assessing and developing fair and accurate grades takes a lot of time. But it's vital that it's done correctly and the time is taken to get those accurate results. Regardless, you'll be required to report grades for all your students. It's important to know that grades are not only for your students or for you, they're used to report information to the teachers, to administrators also, because administrators need to understand what you're doing in the classroom because they want to support you. Just a quick note, I remember when I was teaching physical education and I was called in one summer to kind of justify some grades. A couple of students didn't feel, or their parents didn't feel that they received a fair grade. They received D's in PE and they couldn't understand why. Well, one summer I had to go in and try to justify it, but because all of my structured rubrics and assignments and my assessments were unclear or vague and they really couldn't be discerned from the administrative point of view, I had to kind of verbally explain those, but the written documents, because they didn't clearly structure why a student received a particular grade, I was forced to change those students' grades. And that can be detrimental for a teacher. So poor assessments and gradings are huge in making physical education seem less important than other academic areas. A lot of teachers assess one part of student performance, and many of those are not done effectively. So when developing grades, all learning domains need to be taken in consideration when assessing. Number one, the psychomotor domain, and that's the actual physical part of PE, the moving, the participation, the engagement, being active. This is pretty much, done all the time because psychomotor domain is what physical education is made up of. But also the cognitive domain, those mentally engaging activities. Think beyond the typical learning of rules, history of activity, and consider higher level thinking. If you're not familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, take a look at that because students will be challenged to analyze their own movements, to apply changes to performance, to recognize how those changes are going to affect the outcome, to strategize, and to improve their performance techniques. All of these things require a sense of cognitive development and understanding. And so it's important, Bloom's taxonomy takes this into consideration, it's important to move students along from the very basic level of just kind of repeating or mimicking something that's done to challenging them to think differently. And then, of course, the affective domain. And these are the behaviors, the attitudes, the feelings that are associated with physical education. And this is where attendance, dressing, and things like behavior are taken in consideration. The textbook also identifies showering, which, of course, is no longer a requirement in PE, but the question is, should it be? Maybe some people can take this on as a research proposal project, addressing hygiene and physical education. Just a thought. So again, these three domains should always be covered when determining a final grade and going through the process of assessing a student. So some criteria to remember when developing grades. Number one, they should be related to the educational objectives, meaning you should have previously to assigning or going through assessing develop some objectives. What is it that you want the students to be able to achieve? They should have validity, reliability, and objectivity. That requires a few times of administering the same assessment, recognizing the flaws in that assessment, modifying it, and reapplying it. If you have weighted grades, the weight or the percentage of the portion of the total grade should be related to the emphasis that's placed on the factor during the instructional unit. So you should be assessing exactly what you're teaching, and that should be weighed effectively. The factors and methods of grading should be understandable to students, parents, and administrators. Grades should discriminate good students from poor students. Once again, it's not that everyone's going to get an A, but if you've set up effective grading, it is going to require students to put forth a certain amount of effort, and it will be clear as to what the outcome is, as to how much effort a student has put into that. Grades should have what we call administrative economy. And this means that you've gone through the process, you've used appropriate guidelines to develop and report your grades. They don't take up a lot of time, and the grading process is effective. Now, while there are several different methods of grading, and these are discussed more in the text, I don't want to spend too much time on them here, but be sure you read through the remainder of the textbook and just familiarize yourself with those different types of grades and grading systems. It's the process is what's important. The process that you use when developing your letter grades. That's the important key. And this is really what I want you to focus on. How do you convert your points or percentages or norms or any other criterion to a letter grade? What was the process that you've used to assess the students and reach that end result? And is that a direct reflection of what the students have learned in the classroom? Grading and assessment should follow a linear connection from the national standards to the state standards to the class objectives and the goals, connected to reliable tools, those things that you use to assess the students and test the students. And everything should be clearly communicated to the students, the parents, other teachers, and administrators so that everyone is an equal understanding as to how an end result was achieved. So don't overlook or minimize the importance of assessing student performance and developing grades. It's one of those ways in which a physical educator can determine the effectiveness of their own instruction.